I hope you're starting to see that John the Baptist's message that was embraced by the crowds gives us a real challenge about how we do life together as church today. When we see how that message of John the Baptist and the example of Jesus then flows through into the early church and how they live together as the early church, it challenges us about how we do life together as church. The crowds responded to this practical repentance. They asked what to do, they got answers, and that all fed in and was adopted by the early church into the way they did life. And this challenges this theological concept that I've referred to a few times called the theology of the poor, or liberation theology. The message of the gospel, the message of the church, has always throughout history been attractive to the poor, attractive to those in need, because the overflow of the heart and the nature of the gospel is to meet people where they're in need and to transform their lives. And for people who are hurting and broken, looking for hope, that's an incredibly attractive message, but one that's often rejected by rich people who don't believe they've got any need to be right with God because they've got everything they need, so they don't respond to the gospel. That's a generalisation, I know, and there are always exceptions to that, but I hope you get the sense of what history teaches us. And sometimes we can interpret some of this as a bit of a class war. There are always exceptions. I know incredibly rich people who serve faithfully with an incredibly generous spirit, and I know poor people who reject the gospel because they're too proud to respond. So there are always exceptions. But since the 1960s, something has developed, and it's come out particularly out of Latin America, called liberation theology. And as I've said, there are parts of liberation theology which are not totally healthy, but it does challenge our theology of the poor. The original message of the gospel was freedom, and freedom for people who hold to a liberation theology would interpret freedom as meaning liberation. And that liberation theology is then applied to many groups, and we start to maybe see how this is relevant and applicable to the church today. The message was that the message of the gospel of freedom and setting captives free meant liberating the poor from poverty, liberating people of colour from the racist barriers that there were in society, liberating women from misogynistic, male-dominated culture. And it was interpreted that the message of the gospel of being freedom meant freedom and liberty for people who were oppressed, but freedom from economic and political bondage. Now, many supporters or theologians have gone on from that to say it's not enough to just support the oppressed. If you're committed to the gospel and believe in a gospel of transformation, people must be committed to more than just talking about it, but to a social movement, a social revolution that overturns the structures of societies. So as we start to understand something of this theology, we can potentially see elements of John's message that are relevant to the crowds and introduce us to this idea of challenging what it means to walk out our repentance, what it means for our repentance to be bearing fruit in practical ways.